Good evening. I'm Dawn Daniels, Director of Programs at the Noble Maritime Collection, and I am here to welcome you to the Noble on Watch lecture and concert series. We are pleased to present the first lecture in our two-part program, Untold Stories of the Titanic. This program explores stories that you probably haven't heard before about the fateful voyage and its passengers. I am delighted to introduce Kellie Carter Jackson, PhD. She is the Knafel Assistant Professor of Humanities in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College and is here this evening to present Untold Stories of the Titanic Part 1, The Only Black Passenger.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be able to bring this talk and presentation to you, giving you a whole history of the story of Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche. So oftentimes when I'm telling people about my research, they'll stop me in the middle of a sentence and say, wait a second, there was a Black person on the Titanic? And I always give a little chuckle because I think that when we think about the Titanic, we think of it as an affluent space with wealthy people and Europeans, and we typically don't expect to see a Black person on the ship. But there actually was, and there's a whole history of who he is, his wife, his family, and his descendants. And I'm so excited to be able to share that story with you today. I think most of us are introduced to the Titanic through history, but if you're like a lot of my students, you know most of this history through film. So if you've ever seen the film Titanic by James Cameron, and I'm sure many of you have, given that it was the first film to gross $1 billion in profit, and when it was debuted again, in 2012, it actually debuted another $1 billion. But it's also become one of the most famous films for its romance between Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater. And I think that when we think of this romance and we think of the soundtrack of Celine Dion and, Rose sort of on the ship with her hair blowing in the wind, it really is one of the most iconic romantic scenes in all of cinematic history. And I wondered, what would this film look like and how would we imagine this film if we were to replace Jack and Rose with the love story of Joseph and Juliet? So who are Joseph and Juliet? That's who I want to talk to you about today. When we think about Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche, and I say Laroche because I'm so used to mispronouncing his name. Oftentimes people think it's Larouche, but it sounds like posh, Laroche. When we think of Joseph Laroche and his French wife, he is a Haitian man, and they are boarding a ship to see his family in the island of Haiti. It is 1912, and Laroche is the only Black passenger on the Titanic. Laroche and Juliet and their two small daughters, 3-year-old Simone and nearly 2-year-old Louise, are traveling to start new lives. They're second-class passengers on the RMS Titanic en route from Southampton to New York City, and eventually from New York City on another ship that will take them all the way to their home in Haiti. Laroche was born in Cape Haitian, Haiti on May 26, 1886. At the age of 15, he traveled to Beauvais, France to study engineering. And when Laroche struggled to find employment and to overcome discrimination based on his race, he decided to look outside of France to provide for his growing family. And I think this is really important because oftentimes we don't realize that there's discrimination also happening in France as well. And while there are jobs that Laroche could take, sometimes he was employed but paid underneath what he should have been paid. And it was a struggle for him, particularly because his youngest daughter was always sickly, and so medical bills were piling up for his family. By the time he decided to look for another place of employment in his home of Haiti, Juliet was pregnant with their third child, a son, whom they hoped would be born on the same island as his father. When Laroche's mother learned her son and his family would be making their way to Haiti, she purchased them 4 first-class tickets on a ship called La France. However, at the time, French liners would not allow children to be seated with their parents in the ship's restaurants, and Juliet and Joseph did not want their children to be away from them or relegated to the ship's nursery. So in frustration, they exchanged their first-class tickets for second-class tickets on the brand new starliner, the Titanic. On April 10th, 1912, they boarded the ship along with 2,224 other passengers and crew. And of course, they would not know that this ship would go down in infamy for one of the greatest ships to ever sink. But if you think about what the decision they were making at the time, they thought they were enacting on the best interests of their children and their family. The story of Laroche, his French wife, Juliette Lafargue, and their descendants is largely unknown, and it troubles the assumption of an all-white Titanic narrative held commonly within the United States and throughout the world. It is my hope to be able to place Laroche in a larger moment, a moment that provides historical context for understanding the macro and micro consequences of Black migration and movement. While much has been researched on the Titanic regarding its construction, crew, and passengers, I examine this unexplored aspect of race. For many African Americans, the Titanic represented the ultimate symbol of white hubris. Indeed, in Black memory and literature, the Titanic became a vehicle of jokes and roasts and legends about a possible Black passenger. In oral tradition, African Americans had developed a character named Shine, a Black man who jumps into the water during the sinking of the ship and saves himself by swimming to shore. Shine was used to mock wealthy passengers with lines such as this: "Captain say, shine, shine, save poor me. I'll make you richer than old John D." Shine turned around and took another notion. "Say, Captain, your money's counterfeit in this big-ass ocean." And these roasts were meant to be hilarious. They were meant to be funny, shared among groups of people. And they were meant to mock the idea that people thought a ship could be unsinkable, or mock the hubris of the wealthy, and to sort of make light of the fact that no Black person would find themselves on a ship like this, particularly because the ship was so affluent. The practice of mocking and mourning is how many people came to understand the tragedy of the Titanic in Black thought. The sinking of the Titanic was a small but a significant way of assuaging Black grievances from white terrorism during what Rayford Logan called the nadir of racial politics. And this is a moment in which, it's an intense racial period in American history in which racial violence was quite common. In 1912, Charles Hafer, a Black composer, wrote a song about the Titanic, and that song sold 3,000 copies. Black Americans were angered by the humanity of millionaires. Scholar Lawrence Levine argued that no other contemporary tragedy was as celebrated in Black religious song as the sinking of the Titanic. Though Laroche never stepped foot in America, the connection between the Titanic and Black mobility is critical. I think if it were widely known that an elite person of African descent traveled aboard the Titanic, it would have mattered, particularly for African Americans. For Black people, the Titanic was not about tragedy, but about access to spaces white people coveted. So today I really want to explore the life of the one and only Black passenger on the Titanic and his family. What must it have been like to travel while Black on what many consider to be the world's premier ship as among the world's most wealthiest passengers? It's important to note that Laroche was not traveling as part of the crew or even in the third class. As I mentioned before, he was traveling second class. He was also part of a Black elite. He spoke French and Creole and English fluently. Laroche was also a descendant of the first ruler of independent Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And in 1912, his uncle, Cincinnatus LeConte, was also the great-grandson of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was the president of Haiti. His voyage allows us to better understand the possibilities of Black advancement in the Titanic moment. And I think this is really interesting because Oftentimes, when I tell people this story, first, they're shocked that there was a Black passenger on the Titanic. But second, they're shocked to find out that he wasn't crew, that he wasn't, working somewhere down in the belly of the ship, that he was a second class passenger who was gifted and talented and of high class. So conversely, Laroche also demonstrates the limitations of Black advancement in a racially hostile world. Despite his pedigree and personal accomplishments, he struggled to find steady employment in France and was unable to provide for his family, like I said, prompting for him to return home to Haiti in 1912. I think it's not enough to simply state that Laroche existed. It's more important to address how his existence decenters the U.S. focus of the Titanic narrative and broadens it to include others that can speak to the harsh inequity and possibilities of the lived Black experience. Laroche's life, largely unnoted life, demonstrates how we have imagined Atlantic travel as a set of white privileges. His life story reveals the seemingly inescapable grasp of tragedy and demise that follow Black people wherever they venture, even in their attempts to travel home. So let's get into who Laroche was before he gets to France, while he's in France, and then what prompts his return home. In 1901, Laroche was a brilliant student. He wanted to be an engineer. So he did what others did when they wanted to pursue their educational and professional pursuits. They left the island. There were no engineering schools in Haiti, and Laroche traveled with his instructor, Monsieur Cuzon, the Lord Bishop of Haiti, and they lived in his home while attending school in Beauvais and later in Lille. He attended the Graduate School of Industrial and Commercial Studies at Catholic University in Lille from 1904 to 1907, and he completed his 3-year degree in the area of manufacturing. When he met his wife, Juliette Lafargue, through his instructor, they became friends and soon lovers. After Laroche graduated school, the couple married in March of 1908 in the home of the Lafargues in the city of Villeneuve, a city just outside of Paris. In March of 1908, Laroche had found his partner in life, but securing his profession did not come with the same amount of ease. Despite his degrees and qualifications, racial discrimination in France was common and stifling. Laroche could not find steady employment, and after being out of cheated wages he deserved for his work and talent, he began to become depressed. Employment was not just scarce, it was not scarce for someone of his skills. He knew his talents were needed. And like I said, when he did find work, his employers made excuses that he was young and inexperienced to justify his poor pay. Titanic scholar Judith Geller claimed, quote, "No matter how qualified he was, the blackness of his skin kept him from securing a position that paid his worth." So almost a year into his marriage, February 19th of 1909, Juliet gave birth to their first daughter, Simone. And 17 months later, Juliet gave birth again to Louise. But Louise's birth was complicated. She arrived prematurely and as a result suffered from health problems the first several years of her life. With each major change in the lives of the Laroches, the expenses compounded with unemployment or underemployment. Louise's medical expenses were crippling their finances. They were living with Juliet's father, but Laroche desperately wanted to be able to provide for his own family. His solution to his problems prompted him to return home to Haiti. And it's interesting because Laroche is writing to his family and he's telling them that he wants to come home. We found a copy of a postcard from his cousin that is encouraging him and telling him, don't worry, one day you'll be able to return home. One day you'll be able to come back to Haiti. But the idea that Haiti was a goal of his, I think is really important to note, that he was not necessarily set on settling in France, at least not forever. So we know that because in Haiti, Laroche could find work in his virtually all Black homeland, his uncle and the president of Haiti promised to appoint him as a professorship, as a mathematician, and pay him $200 a month, which was more than a modest salary at the time. In time, his uncle informed him that he could eventually work his way up to headmaster if he chose. Juliet agreed to make the trip with him and to make Haiti their new home. They planned to leave in 1913. But when Juliet discovered that she was pregnant with their third child, they decided it was better to travel pregnant with 2 children than to make the long, laborious trip with 3 little ones in tow. And as a mom of 3, I can tell you, you will be outnumbered very quickly. So the excitement and the anxiety that filled them as they made their plans to travel to this new land, as you can imagine, was one that they all thought about constantly leading up to their day of travel. When they finally boarded the Titanic at 7 p.m. on April 10th, after taking a train from Paris to Cherbourg, an unimaginable sight was before them. Derived from the Greek mythology, the RMS Titanic meant gigantic. And Juliet wrote to her father, quote, "If you could see this monster, our tender looked like a fly compared to her." She told him that their arrangements could not be more comfortable and that she had counted at least 20 other children in second-class accommodations as well. And this is also interesting because if you've ever had to travel with children, you know how important it is to have other children around that can keep your children company, that can entertain one another as they make this long, several week-long trip. Interestingly, scholars have noted that nowhere in the copious press covers of the ship and the interviews for survivors was a Black family ever mentioned. The White Star Line was known for passengers and crew hauling racial slurs at various ethnic groups. In fact, the White Star Line was forced to apologize to its crew's derogatory comments made about Italians. But Titanic scholar Judith Geller claimed, quote, "The only known mention of Simone and Louise Laroche was made by Kate Boss in a letter home. Quote, there are 2 of the finest little Japanese girls about 3 or 4 years old who look like dolls running about the ship." And I think this is interesting because the girls are mixed race and they were very fair skinned. So oftentimes when standing with their mother, people were not able to decipher what their ethnic background was. And standing with their father, they might have been a little bit even more confused. But as the girls grew into adults, Simone and Louise remained very fair skinned. And it was never really clear or readily present what their racial background was other than white. And particularly, people would assume they were white when standing next to their mother. So, as they're on the ship, 4 days into their travel, on April 14th, the voyage, and 4 days into their voyage, the unthinkable happened. The Titanic struck an iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m. There was no way to recover. The collision forced the ship's hull's plates to collapse inwards. 5 of the Titanic's 16 watertight seaside compartments opened. The ship only had capacity to maintain 4 flooded compartments. Panic spread throughout the ship within minutes. Of the 2,222 passengers, it is estimated that only 705 people were rescued from lifeboats that boarded and were able to board the Carpathia. Julia and her 2 daughters were among those survivors. In an interview for Le Matin, Juliet was beside herself. Through her sobs, she recalled the terror she experienced. Quote, "People jostled each other. They were completely engulfed. Crowded by people on every side of her, Juliet did all she could to keep her children close by. The pushing and the shoving was unbearable. And Juliet was not only struggling to keep her daughters by her side, she was also early in her pregnancy. Juliet and Simone were separated from Joseph and Louise and literally thrown into a lifeboat. Just as Juliet secured herself and Simone, she saw on a bridge through the crowd Joseph. He was holding on to Louise with everything he had, trying to protect her from the constant pushing. As he neared his wife, he had a confrontation with one of the sailors. He was trying to convince them that his daughter and his wife had been separated from him. It was likely the crew did not readily believe that Louise was his daughter, or perhaps that this white woman was not his wife. Either way, now was not the time to play identity politics. There was panic all around them. Chaos ensued everywhere. As he continued to plead his case, someone seized Louise and placed her in the arms of Juliet. Juliet had little time to speak to her husband. Within minutes, the rowboat was descending toward the sea with a rapid speed. How would she find him? How would he find them? Which lifeboat would allow him to board, particularly as a Black man? And above all the noise, Juliet heard Joseph shouting the words of encouragement. "See you soon, dear," he assured her. "There will be room for everyone in the lifeboat. Look after our girls. See you soon." And with that, the rowboat plunged into the sea. Now we know that during this particular time, women and children were said to have been put in lifeboats first. So with that, we knew that the opportunity for Joseph to get in a lifeboat himself would also be slightly restricted. And we know that his race would have possibly restricted him even more. So we're not clear as to what happened with Joseph Laroche if he was down with the ship, but we know that he drowned and did not survive. But all during the commotion, and if you can remember, it's the middle of the night, it's past midnight, it's 1 a.m., it's 2 a.m. Juliet has no idea what has happened to Joseph, where he is or where he might be. As day broke, Juliet searched the horizon for the silhouette of the Titanic. She thought they must have rowed a great distance away from the ship. She never witnessed the ocean swallowing the great liner. She recalled hours passed like centuries, until finally at 7 a.m, deliverance arrived. Officers of the RMS Carpathia told the rescue not to worry. Quote, "Other ships beside ours have gone to the Titanic and are at this moment on their way to New York, where you will meet them all again." The crew gave everyone false assurances. And part of this was because they wanted to keep the passengers calm. When the remaining survivors reached New York City, they learned the complete truth, that there would be no husbands, brothers, or fathers waiting for them, and no ship that would arrive after them. Laroche was lost to the sea, and Juliet was all on her own. New York City was a foreign place to Juliet. In the panic to leave, Joseph had thrown on his coat and kept all of their money and precious jewels on his person. Juliet was penniless and pregnant. She also did not speak English. It took her about 3 weeks for her and her girls to make the return trip to Paris on a French liner called the Chicago. And if you can imagine having this, horrible act happen to you, this trauma, and then weeks later having to board a ship again, hoping that there's not a repeat of what happened, the ship home could be nothing but terrifying and also grievous, and the fact that they were still mourning the fact that her husband and the father of her children was not with them. When she arrived in Paris, her father was waiting for them. Equally grief-stricken, she told her father that Joseph had endeavored to reassure her and asserted to her that he would have been saved as she was. Through her tears, Juliet could not stop repeating the refrain, "I believed him. I believed him." If she had known what was about to happen, she would have never agreed to leave him. Juliet blamed herself for her husband's death. She believed that had she not insisted on changing their tickets from La France to the Titanic, all of this could have been avoided. And while historians rarely engage in counterfactuals, destruction still could have followed them. Just 4 months after the Titanic sank, Laroche's uncle and the president of Haiti was assassinated. LeConte died in what many suspected to be foul play. There was a bombing that happened at the palace, or an explosion that took place at the palace that killed the president and several of his cabinet members. Furthermore, a few years after that, U.S. occupation of Haiti begins in 1915 and lasts about 20 years until 1934. So even if they had made it to the island of Haiti, politically, socially, and even economically, their lives would have been quite precarious. After the Titanic, Juliet pledged to leave the past in the past. She was intensely fearful of journalists. She hated recounting her story, and that's understandable. She blamed herself. She wanted to be left to grieve her husband without spectacle. She told her children to never speak of the Titanic. She not only suppressed her past, but she also buried it. Literally, in 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded France, Juliet lived in fear that authorities would not only be seeking out Jewish people, but anyone who seemed different. She worried that people would question the complexion of her daughter's skin. So she buried a suitcase in the backyard that contained every single picture or image that would have linked her children to a Black father. Once again, anti-Blackness placed Laroche's family at risk. The suitcase remained buried in the backyard for 6 years until she was assured that the Nazis would not return. So I want to think about some concluding ideas as we think about what it means to be Black on a ship called the Titanic and what your experience might be like. We do know that while Laroche was on the ship, he was treated very well. He engaged with a lot of the wealthy people and powerful people on the ship who were impressed by his ability to speak multiple languages. But in the end, none of that could save him from the sinking of this ship. And oftentimes I think that we are unaware that there was a Black person on the ship because his wife was French and their daughters almost look white. And so we don't have something that readily points or triggers to us to a Black family on the ship. But I think oftentimes when we think about our fascination with the Titanic, our obsession with this unsinkable ship, it also encapsulates how much we understand about power and whiteness and privilege. I think Laroche connects many Black people to a moment that until recently did not warrant any collective Black remorse. But oftentimes I make the argument that you really can't separate race and mobility. Often they are tied together hand in hand. So I ask the question when thinking about who Laroche is, I ask, who gets to move to certain places? Who has to stay in certain places? Who gets to decide who's pushed into another place, who's pulled into another place? And most importantly, how do we decide who gets access to some of the most coveted spaces? And those coveted spaces aren't just limited to the Titanic itself, but those coveted spaces were limited to the lifeboats in the aftermath of the sinking of the Titanic. I think these are all questions worthy of thinking about, worthy of our investigation. But most importantly, I'm happy to be able to introduce someone that people may not be aware of, the life of Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche, his wife Juliet, and their daughters Simone and Louise. I'm really happy to have this time to share with you today. I hope you will take this information and look a little bit deeper and further to find out more information, not just about the Titanic, but about the passengers on the Titanic as well. Thank you for allowing me to share this history with you.
Part 2 of Untold Stories of the Titanic, The Last Port of Call, will premiere on April 10th. To see this and other programs in the Noble on Watch series, visit noblemaritime.org/now.